Welcome back. There are calls by some economists that government coalition talks should not compromise sectors of the economy. This includes South Africa's financial system, which include the South African Reserve Bank. Joining us is Mudiwa Gavaza, who is an economist, to unpack this further. Mudiwa, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday evening. A word we've been hearing a lot more lately are the markets, when we talk about coalition talks. Tell us more.
Good evening, Masa. Yeah, there's a lot that, one could unpack. But when we talk about the markets, there are a couple of things that people, probably referring to. Usually we're talking about what's going on with the currency, because for a lot of people, the currency is a good barometer of, where, South Africa stands within the context of the global economy. And right now, over the last 5 or so days, the rand is down 2%, which is, quite a relatively big movement. And, stuff like that doesn't tend to bode well. You also have, the stock market, the JSE. Those are two of the biggest markets that we tend to, talk about when we talk about the markets. And then I think just a couple of other indicators that are out there is, depending on how you're feeling, is the bond market. And then I think lastly is depending on, what's going on in the economy, you also then affect growth forecasts for the economy. So when we talk about the markets, those are just some of the things that people are talking about.
Now, as you mentioned, the rand being down 2% as well. Can we attribute this to coalition talks or talks of a government of national unity? Now, before this interview, we were speaking to UDM leader Bantu Holomisa, who was outlining some of the challenges that could be faced with this government of national unity and just not having the clarity. Now, that confusion, is that also playing out in our markets or the economy?
Well, one of the things that we have to always think about is the fact that the rand has a lot of liquidity. And when we talk about liquidity, we mean there's a lot of interest in the rand. There's a lot of buying and selling of the rand. And, usually there's a lot of perception issues that affect the rand. But as much as you might have certain issues happening at home, we tend to see an outsized effect around the US dollar. What the US dollar is doing tends to affect more the rand than what is happening internally. And you'll see that, for example, this week, as much as we are dealing with, all of this uncertainty around the coalition politics in South Africa, you have a couple of data points that have come out in the US. For example, the US jobs data, they said that economy added more than 200,000 jobs, which is more than what people had been expecting. And, such a positive result, then you see positive momentum in the US dollar, and that US dollar strength, you then see the rand coming down. This is not to say that, the rand doesn't get affected by what's happening locally, but at least in the last couple of days, we could possibly attribute more to rand weakness around what's going on in the US. One of the more interesting points that did happen around the rand was on Friday last week, where we saw a bit of a hammering of the rand. And, the consensus was that, some of that was mainly driven by, those initial indications that the ANC was going to be losing, its majority in the national election.
So basically, it's not as black and white as if the ANC goes with this coalition partner, this is what the markets will dictate. And if they go with an opposing coalition partner, then the markets would dictate something else.
Not clear cut and not black and white like that. What it will feed into is, certain sentiment around, especially investment decisions, going forward. When we have a final decision, just around what the structure of government is going to look like, we will possibly see an initial reaction of some sort, because what has been quite interesting to see over the last week or so is just how much international attention the situation in South Africa has received, which is an indication that you do have a big spotlight on South Africa, and that depending on what the outcome of the structure of government will be that we will see a reaction either in the stock market or, we might see something happening in the rand. All I was just showing is that at least in the last couple of days, it's more the US jobs growth that has been affecting the rand. But people are definitely paying attention to what's going on right now. And depending on where things go, some people had part of the thinking is that the DA, for example, is seen as being business friendly. So, the expectation is that a coalition on that front would have, boded well for the markets. But right now we are in a stage where we're talking about a government of national unity. But what tends to happen is that the markets tend to adapt. So whatever is the result next week, at least next week, if the 2-week deadline is adhered to, whatever then happens there, we'll definitely see a reaction. And then people then adjusting what the perception is on South Africa. And then secondly, how they're going to be investing in the country going forward.
And Mudiwa, just touching on that as well, mentioning the DA, there is that perception as well that, you mentioned that they would be friendlier for the market. Is that the reality, though?
Once again, this is one of those things where it is thought that they would be good for the economy. But as we have seen in many different aspects, what tends to be more of a determining factor is execution. A couple of weeks ago, we spoke about the fact that S&P has chosen not to make any decisions around, what's going on with the credit rating for South Africa. So we spoke about a wait and watch approach. And I think that's definitely the case in this particular case. You will see that initial reaction that happens, but over time, we talk about normalization where, okay, you have a structure that's in place, and whether it's the DA or others, is to say, okay, fine, this is what we think this type of coalition would end up doing. We think it would be positive. But now the issue is, what is the actual execution on the ground? What does that look like? And all of that will then feed into perceptions around the country.
But either way, the positive news is that it will just then at some point adjust.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights with us. That is Economist Mudiwa Gavaza, who is joining us via Zoom.